The scream hit me before I even saw the water. I had been sitting on the bank of the Tessara River, boots off, toes in the grass, trying to remember what silence felt like after 14 straight hours at the colony med station. The air on Tessara 4 always carried a strange sweetness, like fruit that was almost ripe but not quite. The river moved fast here, swollen and angry from the seasonal rains, churning brown and white over the rocks. It was the kind of current that could pull a grown man under and never give him back. Then came that sound, high-pitched, sharp, and full of a terror so pure that my body was already moving before my brain caught up. I turned toward the old ceremonial bridge upstream and saw the crowd, dozens of Vehlari standing in their flowing silver robes, frozen in place like statues carved from pale blue stone. They were in the middle of some kind of festival procession, lanterns and woven garlands strung along the railing. And at the edge of the bridge, where the railing had crumbled away from years of neglect, there was a gap just wide enough for a small body to fall through. I saw her in the water. A Vehlari child, tiny, no bigger than a human 5-year-old, tumbling through the current like a leaf in a storm. Her arms were flailing, her gill slits flared wide open, and even from 50 meters away, I could see that her movements were already getting weaker. She was drowning. Right there, right in front of her entire community, she was drowning. Her body rolled in the churn, and I saw her face for a split second, her silver eyes wide and wild, her mouth open in a scream that the water swallowed whole. And nobody was jumping in. For one confused second, I could not understand it. The Vehlari looked amphibian. They had smooth, moist skin the color of river stones, wide-webbed fingers, gill slits along their necks. Everything about their bodies said they belonged in water, but then the colony orientation briefing flashed through my memory like a slap. Vehlari gills could not process fast-moving, highly oxygenated fresh water. It flooded their lung analogs. Rapid current was not water to them. It was poison. Jumping in would be the same as a human jumping into a pool of acid. Every adult on that bridge was watching a child die, and there was nothing their biology would let them do about it. Except I was not Vehlari. I did not make a decision. That is what people never understand when they ask me about it later. There was no heroic moment of calculation, no weighing of risks and rewards. My boots were already behind me, my shirt was already over my head, and then the cold hit me like a freight train as I crashed into the Tessara River, and the world turned into noise and pressure and brown water filling my mouth. The current was worse than it looked. It grabbed me like a fist and threw me sideways, spinning me into rocks that slammed against my ribs hard enough to make me gasp. I kicked, fought, clawed my way forward with everything I had. I am not a strong swimmer. I grew up in landlocked foster homes in the middle of Kansas. The deepest water I had ever been in before I left Earth was a public pool that smelled like bleach. But the girl was ahead of me, her small body rising and dropping in the churn, and every time she went under, she stayed down a little longer. The river did not care about heroism. It did not care about intentions, or the fact that a child was dying 20 meters ahead of me. It was just water doing what water does, moving fast and hard and taking everything in its path along for the ride. A submerged branch caught my shoulder and spun me sideways, and for a terrible second, I went under completely, brown water closing over my head like a door slamming shut. I clawed back to the surface, spat water, gasped air, and kept swimming. On the bridge above, I could hear voices now, Vehlari shouting, their words meaningless to me, but the panic in them, universal. I thought I heard someone screaming the child's name, but the river swallowed the sound before I could hold on to it. I reached her in what felt like an hour, but was probably 30 seconds. My hand closed around her arm, and I pulled her against my chest. She was cold. Not human cold, not shivering cold, but the deep alien cold of a body that did not generate its own heat. Her gill slits were wide open, pulsing, trying to close against the rushing water and failing. Her eyes were shut. She was limp. I kicked for the bank. The current fought me for every inch. My legs burned. My lungs burned. A rock caught my knee, and I felt something tear, but I did not let go. I could not let go. Not of this small, cold body pressed against mine. Not of this child who weighed almost nothing, and whose life was emptying out into the river 1 second at a time. My hand hit mud. I dragged us both out of the water and onto the bank, coughing, gasping, bleeding from a cut above my eye that I did not remember getting. I laid the girl on the grass and looked at her, and felt my stomach drop. She was not breathing. Her gill slits had clamped shut, and her chest was not moving, and her skin had gone from pale blue to a gray that I recognized from my training as the color of oxygen deprivation. I am an EMT, not a xenobiologist, not an alien doctor. I work on humans, but the basic principles are the same across any species with a respiratory system. Clear the airway, restore breathing, keep the blood moving. I rolled her onto her side and pressed both hands against her thoracic cavity, the broad flat area below her ribcage, where I guessed her lung analog sat. I pushed hard, then harder, and then pushed again with everything I had. I could feel her ribs under my palms, thinner and more flexible than human ribs, bending under the pressure in a way that made me terrified I was breaking something. But broken ribs heal, drowning does not. I kept pushing. My arms shook. My fingers cramped. I counted compressions out of habit, the same rhythm I had drilled 1,000 times on plastic training dummies in community college classrooms, the same rhythm that never felt real, until this moment, on this bank, with this small alien life going cold under my hands. Water poured out of her mouth, not a trickle, a flood. It came out brown and cold, and kept coming, and I kept pushing, kept compressing, talking to her the whole time even though she could not understand a word of English, and was probably unconscious anyway. "Come on," I said. "Come on, kid. You did not survive that river just to quit on me now." I compressed again, and one more time. She coughed. It was weak and wet, and it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my life. Her body convulsed once, then twice, and then she was breathing, ragged and shallow but real, and her eyes opened. They were silver. Not metaphorically silver, not gray. Silver, like polished mercury, like liquid moonlight poured into the shape of eyes. They were enormous, taking up nearly 1/3 of her small face, and they locked onto me with an intensity that made me forget I was bleeding and freezing and probably concussing. She stared at me. I stared at her, and then she did something I did not expect. She reached up with one small, trembling, webbed hand and pressed it flat against my chest, right over my heart. Her mouth opened, and she made a sound, a single syllable in a language I did not speak. Later, I would learn it meant warm. She had never felt body heat before. To a cold-blooded child who had just been dragged from death, my chest must have felt like the sun itself. Behind me, the silence broke. I turned and saw them coming down from the bridge, dozens of Velari moving through the tall grass toward us. They moved carefully, almost reverently, their silver eyes wide and their long hands clasped in front of their chests. Nobody was running. Nobody was shouting anymore. They moved like people approaching something holy. The festival decorations still hung from the bridge behind them, the lanterns swaying in the wind, the garlands dripping water from where the spray had reached them. It looked wrong, all that celebration suspended in the air while a child lay gasping in the mud below. An elderly Velari at the front of the group stopped 10 meters away and pressed both palms together over his chest. Others did the same. One by one, the entire procession halted and made that gesture, and even without knowing what it meant, I could feel its weight. Then one of them broke from the group, a female, taller than the others, wearing a dark blue robe that was torn at the shoulder, as if she had been clawing at it. She dropped to her knees in the mud 3 meters from me and made a sound that cut through the air like glass breaking. It was grief and relief compressed into a single note, a sound that needed no translation in any language on any world. It was a mother who had just watched her child come back from the dead. She crawled forward on her knees, reaching for the girl, and the girl reached back, and I carefully transferred that small, cold body from my arms to hers. The mother folded around her child like water around a stone, and rocked her, and made that sound again, softer now, private. I sat back in the mud, bleeding, shaking from the cold, and thought about standing up and walking away. That was the protocol. Do not make it political. Do not create an incident. You are a guest on this world. And these people did not ask for your help and did not want your presence. Walk away. File a report. Let the diplomats sort it out. They had drilled that into us during orientation. Do not engage. Do not interfere. Do not make yourself a factor in alien affairs. Be invisible. Be helpful when asked. Be gone when not. But when I tried to stand, I realized the girl was still holding onto my sleeve. Her small fingers were wrapped in the wet fabric of my shirt, and even pressed against her mother's chest, she would not let go. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone who had been clinically gone 3 minutes ago. She held on to me like I was the only solid thing in a liquid world, and maybe I was. I looked at the crowd of Velari. They looked at me. Nobody spoke. The river roared on behind us, indifferent to all of it. I had no idea that what I had just done would change everything. Not just for me, not just for that little girl, for the entire human race. But in that moment, kneeling in the mud with a torn knee and blood in my eyes and a child's fingers wrapped around my sleeve, all I knew was that I was cold and tired and alive, and so was she. That was enough. I tried to leave 3 times. Each time, something stopped me. The first time, I got as far as standing up. The girl's mother looked at me from the ground where she was kneeling, her child pressed against her chest, and she made a gesture I did not understand. She took one hand off her daughter and extended it toward me, palm up, fingers spread. Around us, the crowd made a sound, a low collective murmur that vibrated in my chest like the bass note of a cathedral organ. I froze. Whatever she was asking, it mattered. The second time, I actually took 2 steps toward the path that led back to the human zone. An elderly Velari male, tall and thin, with deep creases around his gill slits, stepped directly into my way. Not aggressively, not threatening. He simply stood there, looked down at me with those enormous silver eyes, and shook his head once. Behind him, 2 others did the same. The third time, the girl herself stopped me. She pulled free from her mother's arms, stumbled across the grass on legs that were still shaking, and grabbed my hand with both of hers. She looked up at me and said that word again, the one that meant warm, and I could not make my feet move after that. My name is Marcus Cole. I am 31 years old. I am an emergency medical technician from Wichita, Kansas, and I have been stationed on Tessera 4 for 11 months as part of the Galactic Concord's Joint Settlement Program. I came here because there was nothing left for me on Earth. No family, no attachments. Nobody who would notice if I disappeared into the black and never came back. The colony needed medics. I needed somewhere to go. It was not a heroic origin story. It was logistics. The Vihari had been on Tessera 4 for over 2,000 years before we showed up. They tolerated our presence because the Concord required it, but tolerate was the strongest word you could use. In 11 months on this world, I had learned exactly 3 things about my alien neighbors. They were polite, they were private, and they wanted nothing to do with us. I had tried making conversation at the trade market. I had smiled at Velari children in the street. I had once helped an elderly Velari male carry a heavy container up a steep path. Every attempt at connection was met with the same response. A slight nod, a careful step backward, a door closing so quietly you could not even be offended by it. Now 60 of them were standing in the rain around me, and none of them would let me walk away. The elder who had blocked my path spoke to the mother, and she answered, and then he turned to me and activated a translation device on his wrist. The words came out flat and mechanical, but the meaning behind them landed like a hammer. "You have performed a Veltharan," the elder said. "Do you understand what this means?" I told him I did not. I told him I was just a medic who happened to be near the river. The elder studied me for a long time. Then he explained. In Velari culture, water holds a sacred and terrible power. Their species evolved from shallow tidal pools, where drowning was the most common cause of death for the young. Over millennia, they developed a profound spiritual relationship with water death. They called it the silence, the one form of dying that could not be mourned, could not be ritualized, could not be reversed. When the water took a Velari, that soul was considered lost beyond all reaching. No ceremony could honor them. No prayer could find them. The silence was absolute. What I had done, pulling Silly from the river, breathing life back into her lungs, That was not just a rescue. It was something their theology said was impossible. I had reached into the silence and pulled a soul back out. In Velari law and religion and tradition, that created a bond called the Veltharon, the life binding. It was unbreakable, permanent, and sacred. It meant that I was now bound to this child, not as a father, not as an uncle, not as any human category I had a word for. I was her shieldborn, her protector across all remaining time. And in their social hierarchy, a shieldborn ranked higher than blood parents, higher than elders, higher than almost anyone. The elder let that settle. I could tell he was watching my face for a reaction, and I imagine whatever he saw there was not what he expected. I was not honored. I was not moved. I was panicking. My chest felt tight and my palms were sweating, and my brain was running through a dozen scenarios, all of which ended with me failing this child, in some fundamental way that would confirm everything the Velari already believed about humans. That we were reckless, impulsive, incapable of commitment, and utterly unsuited for the kind of deep, centuries-long bonds that their culture was built upon. I stood there in the rain, with river water still dripping from my hair, and mud drying on my knees, and I felt the ground shift under me. Not literally, but something fundamental had changed, and I could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. I tried to decline. I said it respectfully. I told the elder that I was honored, that I understood the significance, but that I was just a human guest on their world, and I did not want to overstep my place. I thought it was the diplomatic thing to say. The elder's expression did not change, but behind him, the mother's face crumbled. She pulled her daughter closer and looked at the ground, and I saw something in the set of her shoulders that I recognized immediately, because I had seen it in the mirror 1,000 times growing up. She looked like someone who was used to things being taken away. The girl, Celie, looked up at me from her mother's arms. She still had one hand stretched toward me, reaching. Her silver eyes were wide and confused, and trusting in a way that hit me somewhere I did not have armor. I did not say no again. The human colony administrator, a man named Simon Grant, called me into his office 2 hours later. He was sitting behind his desk with his hands folded in front of him, and the expression of a man who had just been told that one of his janitors had accidentally become alien royalty. "Do you understand what you have done?" he asked. I told him I had saved a drowning child. He told me that saving the child was not the problem. The problem was that the Velari were now formally requesting that I be granted full access to their residential zone. They were not asking politely. They were invoking the Veltharon clause of the Galactic Concord, a provision so old and so rarely used that the human diplomatic corps had to look it up. Under Concord law, a life binding between species carried the full legal weight of a biological family bond. Denying me access to Silly would be the equivalent of separating a parent from a child. Simon leaned back in his chair and told me that some people in the diplomatic corps saw this as an incredible opportunity. 3 years of trying to build bridges with the Velari, and a random medic had just blown the door open. Other people, he said, saw it as a trap, a way for the Velari to install a human in their territory and use him as a bargaining chip. He pulled up a holographic display showing communication logs. In the 12 hours since the river, the Velari had sent more formal correspondence to the human administration than they had in the previous 3 years combined. Requests, notifications, legal citations, all of it centered on me and on the Veltharon bond, and on the urgent need for immediate human compliance with a law that predated spaceflight. He asked me what I thought. I told him I thought a little girl almost died, and that everyone was overthinking it. He rubbed his forehead and said something I would remember for a long time. He said that in 30 years of colonial administration, he had never seen a single act of kindness cause this much paperwork. He gave me a long look. Then he slid a pass across the desk. Full access to the Velari residential zone, effective immediately. I went the next morning. The Velari zone was nothing like ours. Where the human settlement was prefab structures and gravel paths and fluorescent lights, the Velari zone looked like something that had grown rather than been built. The buildings curved like shells, covered in a living bioluminescent moss that shifted color with the time of day. The air was warmer and more humid, carrying a faint mineral scent like wet stone after rain. Pathways wound between structures in spirals rather than straight lines. Everything was designed for a species that experienced the world differently than we did, tuned to wavelengths of light and sound that human senses could barely register. I felt like an intruder. I felt like the loudest, clumsiest, most visible thing in a world built for subtlety. My boots made too much noise on the smooth stone paths. My breathing was too heavy in the humid air. HFY going about their morning routines stopped and watched me pass, their silver eyes tracking me with expressions I could not read. Some of them pressed their palms together over their chests, the same gesture the crowd had made at the river. Others simply stared. I kept my eyes forward and my hands at my sides and tried to shrink into a smaller version of myself, which is a difficult thing for a 180-centimeter human to do in a city built for beings who averaged 2 meters tall and moved through the world like water flowing around stones. Silly was waiting at the entrance. She was standing behind her mother's legs, peeking out with those silver eyes. She looked healthier than yesterday, her skin back to its natural pale blue, her gill slits relaxed and rhythmic. When she saw me, she stepped out from behind her mother and walked toward me with the careful determination of a child who has decided something important. She was holding a small object in both hands. It was woven from thin strips of dried river grass, braided together into a crude circle. It took me a moment to realize it was a bracelet. She had made it herself. The weave was uneven, and one side was coming apart, and it was one of the most precisely aimed weapons I had ever encountered, because it hit me right in the center of everything I thought I had locked away. She held it up to me. Her mother activated her translator, and Celi's words came through in that same flat mechanical tone, but somehow the meaning was clear as glass anyway. "I made this for you," she said, "so you do not get lost coming back." I knelt down. She slid the bracelet over my hand and onto my wrist. It was too small, and it pulled at my skin, and it was absolutely not coming off. She patted it twice with her palm after she finished, a small, satisfied gesture, like a craftsman approving her own work. Then she looked up at me to make sure I understood the gravity of what had just happened. She had given me something. That meant I was hers now. The logic was airtight, at least to a 7-year-old. I looked at this alien child who weighed maybe 15 kilograms, and who had nearly died yesterday, and who had just given me a bracelet made of river grass. And I understood with a clarity that bordered on violence that I was in over my head. I was not a father. I had never been anyone's family. I had spent 31 years on Earth, moving from one temporary situation to the next, never staying long enough for anything to root. I was a man built for leaving, and now, a 5-year-old alien girl with silver eyes and a grass bracelet was looking at me like I was the safest thing in her universe. Her mother, Aelith, stood behind her daughter and watched me with an expression I could not quite decode. It was cautious, but not cold. Something in it reminded me of the way people look at a bridge they are not sure will hold their weight. She did not speak to me that first day, not because of hostility. I think she was studying me, trying to understand what kind of person had jumped into a river for her child, and whether that person could be trusted with the enormous thing her culture had just placed on his shoulders. I stood up and looked at the world around me, alien and strange, and humming with a light I could not name. I looked at the bracelet on my wrist. I looked at Celi. I told her I would come back tomorrow. She smiled. It was the first time I had seen a HFY smile, and it was not like a human smile at all. More of a softening around the eyes, a slight parting of the lips, a shift in the luminescence of her skin, but it communicated the same thing: joy. Simple, uncomplicated joy. The kind that children of every species carry in them before the world teaches them to guard it. I walked back to the human zone that evening, feeling like I had stepped off a cliff and was still waiting to find out if there was ground beneath me. My colleagues at the med station asked where I had been. I told them I had been to the HFY zone. They stared at me like I had said I had been to the center of the sun. Nobody from the human settlement had ever been inside those walls. Nobody had ever been invited. I lay on my bunk that night and stared at the ceiling, and felt the grass bracelet tight around my wrist, and thought about a girl with silver eyes who had given me the one thing nobody in my entire life had ever given me before: a reason to come back. Weeks passed, and I stopped falling. That is not to say I found solid ground. It is more accurate to say I learned to live in the air, to accept that my life had split into two halves that did not quite fit together. Mornings at the med station, stitching up construction injuries, and treating respiratory infections, and logging supply requests. Evenings in the Velari zone, sitting on the floor of Aelith's home, while Silly tried to teach me the basics of her language, and I tried to teach her English, and we both mostly failed, and laughed about it. Seely's language was not like any human language I had encountered. The Vehlari communicated through a combination of spoken syllables and bioluminescent color shifts in their skin. The words carried one layer of meaning, and the colors carried another, and you needed both to understand what was actually being said. A Vehlari could say I am fine in words, while their skin pulsed dark amber, which meant I am terrified, and both layers were considered equally valid parts of the communication. It was a language that made lying almost impossible. I could manage maybe 30 words of spoken Vehlari after 3 weeks. The color language was beyond me entirely. My skin did not glow. Seely found this endlessly hilarious. She would pulse through colors while watching my face, waiting for a reaction, and when my skin stubbornly refused to change, she would collapse into the Vehlari equivalent of giggles, a rapid flickering of pale gold across her cheeks. Her English was better than my Vehlari. Children learn faster than adults in any species, apparently. She had picked up hello, goodbye, yes, no, and warm within the first week. By the third week, she had added river, food, sleep, big, small, funny, and a word she used more than any other, stay. Stay. She said it every evening when I stood up to leave. Not as a command, as a question. Will you stay? Her silver eyes would track me across the room as I gathered my things, and she would say that word, and every time it cost me something to walk out the door. I learned about her life in fragments, the way you learn about anyone when language is a barrier. Aelith told me some things through the translator, other things I pieced together from observation. Seely's father had been a territorial patrol officer who died in a border skirmish 2 years ago, not with humans, but with a rival Vehlari faction on the far side of the continent. The details were unclear, and Aelith did not offer them, and I did not ask. What I could see was the shape of his absence. There were gaps in their home where someone used to be. A sleeping platform built for two that Aelith used alone. A set of tools mounted on the wall that had not been touched in years. A space at the table where nobody sat. Aelith was a botanist, mid-ranking, working in the colony's agricultural research division. She was respected for her work, but not for her situation. Single Vehlari mothers occupied an uncomfortable position in their culture. The Vehlari valued family structure with an intensity that made human social expectations look casual by comparison. A household without a male partner was considered incomplete, and the community's response was not cruelty exactly, but something worse. It was a quiet, persistent, suffocating pity that wrapped around everything like fog. I recognized it. Not the specifics, but the texture. The way it felt to be seen as someone who was missing something fundamental. I had grown up in the foster care system in Kansas, bouncing between families who kept me for 6 months or a year before deciding I was not quite what they were looking for. Nobody was cruel. Nobody hit me, or starved me, or locked me in a closet. They just kept handing me back, like a library book that had been checked out by mistake. And the thing that stays with you from a childhood like that is not anger. It is the quiet understanding that you are optional. I saw that same understanding in Silly sometimes, a hesitation before she reached for my hand, as if she was giving me a chance to pull away first. A slight dimming of her skin light when I mentioned leaving for the evening. She was a child who had already learned that people could disappear, and she was bracing for it to happen again. I did not tell her it would not happen. I was not in the business of making promises I could not guarantee, but I showed up. Every day I showed up. Not everyone was happy about the arrangement. I first heard about Dorvan from a passing comment at the trade market. A Vehlari merchant I had been buying fruit from leaned forward and said through his translator, in a tone that was almost apologetic, that I should be careful. There were people on the Elder Council who believed that a human holding Shieldborn status was an abomination. The merchant did not use the word abomination. His translator rendered it as a deep wrongness in the fabric of things. Which was worse, somehow. Dorvan was a senior council member, old even by Vehalri standards, which meant he was ancient by mine. He had held his seat for over a century. He was a traditionalist in the deepest sense, a keeper of customs and laws and precedents, and from his perspective, what had happened at the river was not a miracle, it was a mistake. The Veltaran bond was sacred, precisely because it had always been between Velari. It was a bond of shared biology, shared culture, shared time. Humans lived 80 years if they were lucky. Vehlari lived for centuries. A human shieldborn was a contradiction in terms. A guardian who would age and wither and die while his ward was still functionally a teenager. I heard about Dorvan's objections secondhand at first, filtered through whispers and glances. Then I heard them directly. He came to Aelith's home one evening while I was there. He was tall, even by Velari standards, with deep grooves in his skin that spoke of extreme age, and a pattern of dark coloration around his gill slits that I later learned signified high social standing. He did not acknowledge me. He did not look at me. He walked past me as if I were a piece of furniture that someone had placed in an inconvenient location, and he spoke to Aelith in rapid Velari that the translator struggled to keep up with. I caught fragments. The bond is corrupted. The human cannot fulfill. Seelie deserves continuity, time, future. Seelie was in the next room. I could see her through the open doorway, sitting on the floor with her stones arranged in a circle, frozen mid-game, listening. Her skin had gone dim and still, the way it always did when she was frightened, and I felt something hot and unfamiliar move through my chest. It took me a second to recognize it as anger, not the frustration I usually felt. Real anger, the kind that comes from watching someone you love be made small by someone who believes they have the right. Aelith responded quietly but firmly, her skin pulsing a steady deep blue that even I could read as controlled anger. Dorvan looked at me once, briefly, the way you look at a stain on a tablecloth, and left. He did not say goodbye. He did not close the door gently. The message was clear. I was in error, and errors get corrected. After he was gone, Aelith sat down and did not speak for a long time. When she finally looked at me through the translator, she said something that surprised me. "He is not wrong about all of it," she said. She was talking about the lifespan difference, and the worst part was, I agreed with her. I had been thinking about it every night since the bonding ceremony. Silly was 7 Vehlari years old. She would live for 300 more. I would be lucky to see another 50. I would age and slow and eventually die, and she would still be young, and she would lose her shieldborn the same way she lost her father. Not to violence this time, but to the simple mathematics of biology. I started pulling back. I did not do it consciously. I told myself I was busy at the med station. I told myself I needed rest. I skipped an evening visit, then 2. I sent messages through the colony communication system instead of going in person. I was protecting her, I told myself. I was creating distance so that when the inevitable separation came, it would hurt less. On the 3rd day I missed, Aelith sent me a message through the colony communication system. It was short. It said that Silly had waited by the entrance for 4 hours. She had brought a new game she wanted to show me, something involving small stones and a counting system she had invented. When I did not come, she put the stones back in her room and went to bed early without eating dinner. I read the message twice. Then I deleted it and told myself it was for the best. I was lying. I was protecting myself. I was doing what I had always done, leaving before I could be left. It was the only survival skill I had ever really perfected, and I was running it now like a reflex, pulling up roots before they could take hold, dismantling the connection before it could become something I could not live without. Then Silly got sick. It started with a cough, which Aelith told me was common in Velari children and usually passed in a few days, but it did not pass. It got worse. Her breathing turned ragged, her skin lost its luminescence, and her temperature dropped below even the normal Velari range. By the 4th day, she was in the Velari Medical Center, and I heard about it from Simon Grant, who mentioned it in passing during a briefing, as if it were a minor diplomatic note. A small thing, a sick child in the other zone, hardly relevant to colonial operations. The words hit me like a physical blow. I was on my feet before Simon finished his sentence, and I was out the door before he could ask where I was going. I ran the entire way to the Velari zone, through the human settlement, past the neutral buffer zone, through the spiral entrance paths, past startled Velari pedestrians who had to press themselves against walls to let me through. I ran like the river was pulling her down again, and I was the only one who could reach her. I was in the Velari Med Center within 20 minutes. It was the first time I had been inside a Velari medical facility. The technology was different from ours, more biological than mechanical. Instead of machines and monitors, they used living diagnostic organisms, small bioluminescent creatures that attached to the patient's skin and changed color based on internal conditions. The room was warm and humid and quiet, lit only by the soft glow of the diagnostic organisms and the dim pulse of Celi's skin. She was lying on a curved platform that molded to her body, surrounded by 3 Velari physicians who moved with the calm precision of experts. Aelith was sitting beside her, holding her hand, looking like she had not slept in days. When Celi saw me, her skin flickered. It was weak, barely visible, but the color was unmistakable, pale gold, the same shade she used when she laughed. She was happy I was there. I stood back and watched the physicians work. I did not interfere. These were not my patients. This was not my medicine. And the last thing a sick child needed was a foreign medic with no relevant training barging in with opinions. But I watched. And I listened. I studied the diagnostic organisms, the way they shifted color in response to Celi's internal chemistry, the patterns they formed across her skin, like a living heat map of everything going wrong inside her small body. I compared what I was seeing to the treatments being administered. I checked the response timelines. The primary treatment should have been working by now. The fact that it was not told me something was being missed. And after an hour, I noticed something. The diagnostic organisms on Celi's chest were showing a pattern I recognized. Not from Velari medicine, from human medicine. The primary infection was respiratory, standard for a Velari child, and the physicians were treating it competently with bioengineered counterorganisms that targeted the specific pathogen. But underneath the primary infection, there was a secondary layer, a bacterial complication that was feeding off the weakened tissue and producing toxins that the primary treatment was not designed to address. I had seen something similar in human patients dozens of times. A virus softens the tissue, bacteria move in behind it, and if you only treat the virus, the bacteria keep multiplying until the patient crashes. I approached the head physician carefully and spoke through my translator. I told him what I was seeing. I described the secondary infection pattern. I suggested a diagnostic test that would confirm or rule out my theory. He listened. Then he dismissed me. Politely, professionally, but completely. He told me that Velari respiratory medicine had been refined over centuries, and that a human medic's observations, while appreciated, were not relevant to Velari physiology. I looked at Celi. Her skin was dim. Her breathing was labored. The diagnostic organisms on her chest were flickering in a pattern that was getting worse, not better. I asked again, more firmly this time. I told the physician that I understood his expertise and respected it, but that the secondary pattern I was describing was not species-specific. Bacterial opportunism works the same way in any organism with a respiratory system. I was not diagnosing. I was asking him to test. He looked at Aelith. Aelith looked at me. Something passed between us in that look, some calculation of trust that went beyond words or translators. She turned to the physician and spoke a single sentence in Velari. He ran the test. It took 40 minutes to get the results. The secondary bacterial infection was there, exactly where I said it would be, already advanced enough that another day without treatment would have made it life-threatening. The physicians adjusted their approach. They added a secondary counterorganism targeting the bacteria. Within 6 hours, Celi's breathing stabilized. Within 2 days, she was sitting up and trying to teach the diagnostic organisms to play with her. Within a week, she was home. The head physician found me in the hallway on the day Celi was released. He was a proud being, I could see that. And what he was about to say cost him something. He told me, through the translator, that my observation had likely saved the child's life. He said that the secondary bacterial pattern was something Velari medicine had encountered before but always in adult patients, and it had not occurred to his team to check for it in a child so young. He paused, then added that perhaps there was value in seeing things through unfamiliar eyes. It was the closest thing to an apology I was going to get, and it was more than enough. I was sitting outside the med center on the evening of the second day, alone, looking at the grass bracelet on my wrist. The weave had loosened over the weeks. It was barely holding together. I was thinking about replacing it, or repairing it, or just letting it fall apart naturally, the way everything in my life eventually did. Aelith sat down beside me. We did not speak for a while. The translator hung between us like a bridge that neither of us was sure we needed anymore. Then she said something that reached into me and rearranged the furniture. "You see her," she said. "Not as obligation, not as alien. You see Seelie. That is why the river gave her to you." I looked at the bracelet. I looked at the sky. I looked at this woman who had lost her partner and nearly lost her child, and who was sitting in the dark next to a stranger from another world, because that stranger had seen what 3 Vehlari physicians had missed. I stopped pulling back after that. I stopped making excuses. I stopped calculating exit strategies and measuring safe distances and preparing myself for the eventual leaving. Because Aelith was right. I did see Seelie, not as a duty, not as a diplomatic incident. I saw a kid who liked to laugh and who was afraid of being forgotten and who had given me a bracelet made of river grass and asked me to stay. And I was going to stay. From a balcony above the med center, a tall figure watched me leave. I did not see him, but I felt it, the weight of someone measuring me and finding me insufficient. Dorvan was not finished. The next 2 months were the closest thing to peace I had experienced since I was old enough to understand what peace meant. Seelie healed completely. Her energy came back first, then her luminescence, then the irrepressible curiosity that I was beginning to understand was simply who she was. She wanted to know everything. She wanted to know why human skin did not glow, and why I ate my food heated instead of raw, and why my eyes were so small, and what the sounds meant when I hummed while walking. She asked questions faster than the translator could process them, stacking them on top of each other until the device gave up and produced a garbled string of nonsense that made us both laugh. I taught her to whistle. This was an accident. I was walking through the Vehlari zone one evening, whistling a tune I did not even realize I was making, and Seelie stopped dead in the path and stared at me like I had just produced fire from my fingers. Vehlari cannot whistle. Their mouths are shaped wrong for it, wider and thinner than human mouths, with a jaw structure that does not support the kind of lip tension whistling requires. The sound was completely alien to her. She spent 2 weeks trying to learn. She would pucker her mouth into shapes that looked painful, blow air until her cheeks inflated, and produce sounds that ranged from a wet hiss to something resembling a deflating balloon. She never managed a proper whistle, but she got close enough to produce a faint, breathy tone that was uniquely hers, and she would practice it constantly, walking through the Vehlari zone, producing this tiny half-whistle that made everyone who heard it stop and stare. In return, she taught me to read color language, not with my skin, which remained stubbornly monochrome, but with my eyes. She would pulse through sequences of color, and I would try to name what she was saying. Blue for calm, gold for happy, deep red for angry or afraid, green for hungry, a shimmering violet that meant something like love, but not exactly. More like the feeling of being in the right place at the right time, with the right person. I got good enough to read her basic emotional states without the translator, which pleased her enormously, and which made our communication faster and stranger, and more intimate than anything I had experienced with another person, human or otherwise. I was becoming a bridge. Other Vehlari started acknowledging me, not with the polite distance they had maintained for 3 years, but with genuine warmth. Children waved at me in the streets. An old shopkeeper who sold imported mineral supplements started setting aside a specific type of sweetened fruit that she had noticed I liked. A group of young Vehlari scientists invited me to observe a demonstration of bioluminescent agricultural techniques and did not seem to mind when I asked basic questions that must have made me sound like a child. Even Aelith was changing. The caution in her eyes had not disappeared, but it had shifted, softened into something closer to curiosity. She started speaking to me without the translator sometimes, slowly, in simple Vehlari that I could mostly follow. She told me about her work with agricultural microorganisms. She asked about Earth. She asked, once, what rain felt like to a species that could enjoy it, without fear of drowning, and when I described standing in a warm summer storm with my face turned up and my mouth open, she looked at me with an expression that I could not name in any language. I should have known it could not last. Good things in my life never had, but I had gotten careless with hope, which is always where the trouble starts. The summons came on a quiet afternoon. A formal delegation of 3 Vehari, in ceremonial robes, arrived at Aelith's home and requested my presence before the Elder Council. Their language was polite. Their skin colors were not. I had learned enough color language by then to read the dark amber undertones that meant something difficult is coming. I stood in the council chamber an hour later, a vast circular room, carved from living stone, lit by thousands of bioluminescent organisms, embedded in the walls. The ceiling was open to the sky, and the late afternoon light fell in a column onto the center of the floor where I stood. Around me, arranged in a rising spiral of carved stone seats, sat the members of the Elder Council. 22 Vehari, some so old that their skin had faded to nearly white, others younger but no less severe. Dorvan sat at the highest point of the spiral. He looked down at me with an expression of absolute certainty. He knew exactly how this was going to go. He spoke through a translator mounted on the chamber wall, his voice calm and precise and devastating. He had invoked a Kethfall, he said, a formal challenge to a guardianship bond. Under Velari law, any Elder Council member could challenge a shield-born bond if they believed the bond was harmful to the child. The challenge was ancient, rarely used, and absolute. If I failed, my shield-born status would be stripped, my access to the Velari zone revoked, and my bond with Seelie severed permanently. I would never be allowed to see her again. The challenge consisted of 3 trials. They were designed to test whether a shield-born was truly worthy of the child's future. They tested endurance, knowledge, and sacrifice. They had been designed by Velari, for Velari, hundreds of years ago. No human had ever faced them, and they were not calibrated for human biology. Dorvan was betting that I would fail. He was betting that a short-lived, warm-blooded, soft-skinned human could not survive tests built for a species that had been evolving on this world for 50,000 years. And looking at the faces of the council members around him, I could see that most of them agreed. I had 72 hours to prepare. I spent the first 12 of those hours angry, not at Dorvan, at myself, for allowing this to happen, for opening a door I could not close, for letting a child attach herself to me when I should have known that the universe does not let people like me keep the things they love. I spent the next 12 hours in the human zone, reading everything I could find about Velari history, biology, and law. Simon Grant offered to file a diplomatic protest. I told him no. This was not a political problem. This was a father fighting for his child, and the fact that I was not technically her father, and she was not technically my child, did not change the fundamental truth of it. I spent the last 48 hours with Seelie. She did not know about the challenge. Aelith and I agreed to keep it from her. We spent those 2 days doing the things we always did, walking through the bioluminescent gardens, practicing her half-whistle, sitting by the edge of a small decorative pond where the water was shallow and still and safe. She told me about a dream she had where she could fly, and I told her about airplanes, and she was amazed that humans had actually built machines that let them do what she had only imagined in sleep. On the morning of the trials, I kissed the top of her head. Her skin was cool and smooth under my lips. She said stay, the way she always did, and I said I would come back, the way I always did, and I walked into the council chamber, feeling like I was walking into my own funeral. The first trial was endurance. They took me to the ancestral caves beneath the colony, a network of tunnels carved by underground rivers over millions of years. The caves were pitch black, near freezing, and home to bioelectric predators, small fast creatures that hunted by detecting heat signatures. Velari were cold-blooded. In the caves, they were invisible. I was warm-blooded. In the caves, I was a beacon. I had to survive one full night cycle, 12 hours. The first 3 hours were the worst. The cold settled into my bones like concrete. I could not see anything, not my hands, not the walls, not the ground beneath my feet. I moved by touch, fingers trailing along wet stone, feet testing every step before I committed my weight. Twice, I nearly walked off ledges into open shafts that dropped into nothing. The predators found me around hour 4. I heard them first, a high-frequency clicking that bounced off the walls and seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then I felt them, brief touches against my ankles, my wrists, my neck, light and fast, like fingers testing the surface of something before deciding whether to bite. I could not outrun them. I could not hide from them. My body heat was a searchlight in the darkness, so I did the only thing I could think of. I used it. I found a narrow passage, barely wide enough for my shoulders, and I wedged myself into it. Then I started exercising. Push-ups, sit-ups, anything that would raise my core temperature and concentrate my heat signature into the tightest possible point. The predators crowded around the opening of the passage, drawn by the warmth. But the passage was too narrow for more than one at a time, and when they tried to enter, I was ready for them. I kicked and shouted, and made myself as large and loud and threatening as a human being can be, in a space the size of a coffin. They retreated. They came back. They retreated again. This went on for 8 hours. By the end, my voice was gone, and my body was shaking, and I could not feel my fingers anymore. But I was alive. When the council members opened the cave entrance at dawn and found me sitting in the passage, bruised and frozen and furious and very much not dead, I saw something shift in their faces. Not respect, not yet, but surprise. They had expected to find a corpse. The second trial was knowledge. I stood in the council chamber again, this time in front of a panel of 3 elders who asked me questions about Silly. Not general questions, specific, intimate, impossible to guess, unless you really knew her questions. What food does Silly refuse to eat even when hungry? A mineral paste made from cave lichen, because the texture reminds her of river mud, and river mud reminds her of the day she almost died. What game does Silly play when she thinks no one is watching? She arranges small stones into patterns on the floor of her room, and gives them names, and has conversations with them. The stones are her imaginary friends, and she has 7 of them. What does Silly do when she has a nightmare? She does not cry. She goes completely still, and dims her luminescence until she is nearly invisible. Because she learned during the months after her father died that crying attracted attention, and attention attracted pity, and pity made everything worse. I answered every question. Not because I had studied, because I had been paying attention. Because when you love a child, you notice things. You notice which foods she pushes to the side of her plate, and which ones she reaches for first. You notice the way she talks to herself when she thinks she is alone. You notice the strategies she has built to survive a world that has already hurt her. Then Dorvan asked the final question. He asked it himself, leaning forward from his high seat with his silver eyes fixed on mine. What does Silly fear most? I looked at him. I looked at the council. I looked at Aelith, who was standing at the edge of the chamber, with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Being forgotten, I said. She is afraid of being forgotten. She is afraid that the people she loves will leave, and that the universe will close over the space where they were, and that nobody will remember she existed. The chamber went silent. Aelith covered her mouth with both hands, and her skin pulsed a deep violet that I did not need a translator to read. The third trial was sacrifice. The rules were simple. I had to offer something irreplaceable, something that, once given, could never be recovered. Dorvan had designed this trial to be the killing stroke. He expected me to offer a possession, or a political concession, or some other tangible thing that could be weighed and measured and found wanting. He expected me to think like a human, in terms of objects and transactions. I stood in the center of the chamber, and I felt the weight of every eye in the room. I thought about what I had. I did not own much. I had no property, no wealth, no status, no connections. I had nothing of value except one thing. I had time. Not much of it, by Velari standards. Maybe 50 years if I was lucky. A blink, a breath. A handful of sand falling through a crack. I offered all of it. I spoke slowly, through the translator, making sure every word was clear. I am a human, I said. I will live for decades where you live for centuries. I cannot promise Silly forever. I cannot promise that I will be there when she reaches her 100th year, or her 200th. But I can promise this. Every year I have left, every day, every hour, I will spend making sure she knows she is not forgotten. I will show up. I will keep showing up, until the day I cannot show up anymore. And when that day comes, she will know that I did not leave by choice. She will know that I stayed as long as my body would let me. That is my sacrifice. Not a thing, not a concession. My time, all of it, every second I have left. Dorvan's face did not change. But around him, the council shifted. I heard murmurs. Saw skin colors pulse in patterns I could not fully read but could feel. Something had moved in the room. Some current of emotion that even Dorvan could not redirect. The head elder spoke. The vote was called. The verdict was unanimous. I passed. Dorvan stood slowly from his seat. He looked down at me from the highest point in the chamber, and his translator rendered his final words with mechanical precision. Enjoy your handful of years, human. I looked up at him. I was exhausted, frozen, scraped raw in a dozen places, and so tired I could barely stand, but I was still standing, and I knew something that Dorvan, with his centuries of life, and his ancient traditions, and his unshakable certainty, did not understand. Love does not need to last forever. It just needs to be real. The chamber doors opened. Celie was on the other side. She had been waiting. I do not know for how long. She saw me and she ran, full speed, crashing into my legs with enough force to nearly knock me down. I picked her up. She wrapped her arms around my neck, and her legs around my waist, and pressed her face into my shoulder. And I felt her skin pulse warm against mine for the first time, a flush of heat that Valeri children only produce under extreme emotion. She whispered a word, not in Valeri, in English, a word she had been practicing in secret, saving for a moment she was not sure would ever come. Dad! I held her. I could not speak. I did not need to. Some things do not require language, in any species, on any world, under any sky. I expected the quiet to come back. I had earned it, I thought. 3 trials survived, a bond confirmed, a daughter who called me by a name I never expected to hear from anyone. I thought the universe would give me a few months of peace before finding the next way to rearrange my life without asking permission. The universe, as usual, had other plans. It started 3 weeks after the trials. A ship arrived in orbit around Tessara 4, a diplomatic vessel from the Galactic Concord's Central Administration. This was unusual. Tessara 4 was a frontier colony, not a diplomatic hub. Ships came and went for trade and resupply, but Concord vessels only showed up when something significant had happened. I found out what that something was when Simon Grant appeared at my quarters at 6 in the morning, looking like a man who had slept badly and was about to sleep worse. The story had gotten out. Not just to the neighboring systems, not just to the regional Concord offices, everywhere. The tale of a human medic who had pulled a Vehalari child from sacred water death, who had bonded with her, who had survived 3 ancient trials to prove his worth, was spreading across the galactic communication networks, like fire through dry grass. It was being told in council chambers, and trading posts, and university lecture halls on 100 different worlds. Simon told me that I had become, without my knowledge or consent, the most famous human being in the known galaxy. I asked him if he was joking. He was not joking. Over the following weeks, they came. Diplomats, scholars, journalists, cultural analysts, representatives from species I had never heard of and could not pronounce. They arrived on Tessara 4 in a steady stream, and they all wanted to meet me. The human who walked into the silence, the warm-blooded guardian, the shield-born. I hated it. I am not built for attention. I spent my childhood trying to be invisible, because invisible children get to stay a little longer before they get moved to the next home. I have no talent for speeches or diplomacy, or the careful art of saying things that sound important while meaning nothing. I am a medic. I fix people. I do not perform. But I met with them, not for my sake, for Celie's. Because every delegation that came to Tessara 4 to meet the human shieldborn also saw the Vehlari zone and the human zone existing side by side, and they saw Celie and me walking through both without hesitation, and they saw something that the galaxy apparently had never seen before. Two species choosing each other, not because of politics or trade or military alliance, but because a man jumped into a river and a child grabbed his sleeve, and neither of them let go. The reactions varied by species, and that was the part that fascinated me. The Torvali ambassador, a massive crystalline being who communicated through resonant vibrations, was stunned that I had entered lethal water voluntarily. In Torvali culture, self-preservation was the highest biological imperative. The idea that a human would risk death for a child of another species was not just unusual to the Torvali. It was literally incomprehensible. He spent 4 hours asking me questions through a series of increasingly complex translators, trying to understand the neurological mechanism that would allow an organism to override its survival instinct for a stranger. I told him there was no mechanism. I told him I just did it. He vibrated at a frequency that his translator rendered as profound disturbance. The Melusine delegation, a group of small, insectoid beings who operated as a collective consciousness, could not process the concept of individual bonding with a non-related child. In Melusine society, all children were raised communally. The idea that one adult would form a specific, exclusive, lifelong attachment to one child was, to them, like discovering a species that breathed water. Technically possible but deeply strange. They watched me interact with Silly for an entire afternoon, recording everything through their compound eyes, and when they left, they transmitted a report to their homeworld that reportedly caused a major philosophical debate among the collective. The Drenathi were different. The Drenathi were a warrior species, scarred and practical, who measured worth in combat effectiveness and strategic value. Their representative, a veteran officer with 3 prosthetic limbs and an expression like carved granite, sat across from me and asked a single question. Why did you offer your lifespan as a sacrifice when you could have offered something less costly? I told her that time was the most honest currency I had. Anyone can give away objects. Anyone can make political concessions, but time is the one thing you cannot replace, and offering it means you are telling the truth about how much you care. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something through her translator that made me sit back in my chair. Your species, she said, is the most dangerous thing in this galaxy. Not because of your weapons, not because of your technology, because you care about things that will cost you everything, and you do it anyway. There is no defense against that. I did not know what to say to that. I still do not. The galactic attention had consequences I did not anticipate. On the colony, the relationship between humans and Velari began to shift, not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, like a tide coming in. Velari, who had never spoken to humans before, started showing up at the trade market, not to buy but to talk. Human construction teams were invited to help with a Velari agricultural project. A group of Velari and human children started playing together in the neutral zone between the settlements, inventing games that did not require a shared language, because children are better at communication than adults have ever been. Silly was at the center of it. She had become something neither species had expected. A living proof that the wall between them was not a wall at all. It was a habit, and habits can be broken. Then the ship came from the Velari homeworld. Not from the colony, from the homeworld. A vessel the size of a small city, elegant and curved, and covered in bioluminescent patterns that shifted as it moved through the atmosphere. It settled into orbit like a moon deciding to stay, and the colony went quiet with the particular silence that means something is about to change permanently. The Velari High Council had sent an envoy, not the local Elder Council, the colony administration, the dispute mediators, the High Council, the governing body of the entire Velari civilization, 6 billion souls spread across 47 worlds. They wanted to see me. The ceremony took place in the open air, on a broad stone platform that overlooked the Tessara River, at the point where it widened into a calm, shallow delta. The choice of location was deliberate. This was where the river slowed down, where the water that had almost taken Silly became gentle and navigable. The Velari had a talent for symbolism. The envoy was a female named Selhar, ancient even by Velari standards, with skin so pale it was almost translucent, and eyes that had faded from silver to a deep, steady white. She moved slowly, supported by 2 attendants, But when she spoke, her voice carried the kind of authority that does not need volume. She told the assembled crowd, 300 Vehlari and 50 humans standing together on the riverbank, a story I had never heard. Thousands of years ago, when the Vehlari were still a young species, they had a prophecy. Not a religious prediction, not a mystical vision, but a cultural narrative that had been passed down through generations as a kind of hope. The prophecy spoke of the Warm One, a being from beyond the water who would walk into the silence and bring back what was lost. The Warm One would not be Vehlari. The Warm One would not understand the silence or fear it the way Vehlari feared it. The Warm One would simply reach into the dark water and refuse to let go. The prophecy was considered a metaphor by most Vehlari scholars, a story about hope in the abstract, not a literal prediction of an alien medic from Kansas pulling a child out of a river. But Selhar did not believe in coincidences, and neither, apparently, did the High Council. She announced, in a voice that the translators carried to every ear on the platform, that the High Council had voted unanimously to extend a recognition that had never been offered to any non-Vehlari species in the history of their civilization. Full Shieldborn status, not for me, for humanity. The entire human race was being formally recognized as Shieldborn to the Vehlari people, protectors, guardians, partners in the deepest sense that Vehlari culture could articulate. This was not a treaty. It was not a political alliance. It was a family bond, extended across species lines, from one civilization to another. The practical implications were staggering. Full territorial sharing rights on all Vehlari worlds. Access to Vehlari biotechnology, which was centuries ahead of anything humans had developed. A permanent seat on the Vehlari Elder Council, for a human representative. Scientific collaboration, cultural exchange, mutual defense, the full weight of a 6 billion-strong civilization opening its doors to ours. Simon Grant, standing beside me, made a sound like the air had been punched out of him. Behind me, I heard human colonists talking in hushed, rapid voices. I heard laughter. I heard someone crying. But I was not listening to any of it. I was looking at Silly, who was standing with Aelith at the front of the crowd, wearing a new robe that was slightly too big for her, and watching me with those silver eyes, and I was thinking about a grass bracelet, and a half-whistle, and the word stay. They kept calling it a reward. Every ambassador, every journalist, every analyst who wrote about the event in the following weeks framed it that way. The human who saved an alien child and received an unbelievable reward, as if there had been a transaction, as if I had jumped into a river with the expectation of galactic diplomatic access in return. They did not understand. None of them understood. The reward was not the treaty. The reward was not the technology, or the territorial rights, or the seat on the Elder Council. Those were consequences, important and valuable and world-changing, but they were not the thing itself. The real reward came later that evening, after the ceremony, after the speeches, after Simon Grant had shaken my hand for the 15th time and told me that I had single-handedly altered the trajectory of human civilization, and could I please try to look a little happier about it. Silly took my hand and pulled me away from the crowd. She led me down the riverbank, through the tall grass, past the point where the path ended and the wild growth began. She moved with the confidence of a child who knew exactly where she was going, and I followed, because I always followed, because that was what I did now, because somewhere along the way, this small blue person with the silver eyes had become my compass, and I did not navigate without her. She stopped at the spot. I recognized it immediately. The muddy stretch of bank where I had dragged us both out of the water. The grass was different here, greener, thicker, fed by the sediment we had disturbed. The current was still fast, still dangerous, still roaring past with the same indifferent violence that had almost taken her from the world. There was a stone marker by the water's edge. It was new. Someone had set it into the ground recently, and the surface had been carved with careful, deliberate marks. On one side, Vehlari color language, patterns of pigment embedded into the stone that shifted and glowed in the fading light. On the other side, English letters, wobbly and uneven, and clearly carved by a small hand that was still learning the shapes. Here is where I was found. not saved. Found. As in, this is where I began. This is where the person I was supposed to become started existing. Before this spot, I was a child who had lost her father and was drowning in a river and in grief, and in the quiet certainty that the universe did not care. After this spot, I was someone's daughter. I knelt beside the stone and read it 3 times. I ran my fingers over the English letters, feeling the grooves where Silly's hands had pressed the carving tool into rock, shaping a language that was not hers, to write a message she wanted me to understand without translation. Silly stood beside me. Her skin pulsed that shimmering violet that I had learned meant something like love, but not exactly, more like the feeling of being precisely where you belonged. Aelith appeared behind us. She had followed at a distance, giving us space, and now she stood a few steps back with her hands folded and her skin glowing a soft, steady blue. She spoke, without the translator this time, in slow Velari that she knew I could follow. She told me about a medical procedure, a gene bonding technique that could synchronize my cellular decay rate with a Velari partner's biology. It would not make me Velari. It would not make me immortal, but it would slow my aging to match their pace, extending my lifespan from decades to centuries. It had never been offered to a non-Velari before. The High Council had authorized it specifically for me. She asked if I wanted it. I stood there by the river, where I had almost died saving a child I did not know, wearing a grass bracelet made by that same child, listening to her mother offer me something no human being had ever been offered, and I realized that I was crying, not the subtle, controlled kind, the other kind, the kind that comes from a place so deep that you did not know it existed until something reached down and opened it. I looked at Silly. She was watching me with her head tilted to the side, her silver eyes wide, her skin cycling through colors I had never seen before, a rapid shifting pattern that I later learned was the Velari expression for overwhelming happiness. I looked at Aelith. She was crying too, or the Velari equivalent, a slow cascade of pale light flowing down her cheeks like luminescent tears. I said yes. Of course I said yes. What else could I possibly have said? Later that night, I stood at the river's edge, alone for the first time in what felt like years. The sky above Tessara 4 was full of stars that I was still learning the names of. The water moved past me, dark and fast and alive, and for the first time since I had arrived on this world, it did not sound dangerous. It sounded like breathing. I thought about Kansas, about the foster homes and the empty rooms, and the packed bags, always ready by the door, about the boy I had been, the one who learned to leave before he could be left, who built walls so carefully, and so young, that by the time he was old enough to see over them, he had forgotten there was anything on the other side worth looking at. That boy had jumped into a river 11 months ago, and the man who crawled out the other side was holding a child he did not know, wearing a bracelet made of grass, and standing at the beginning of a life he had never imagined was possible. I thought about Dorvan's words, "Enjoy your handful of years, human." He had meant it as an insult. He had meant it to remind me that I was temporary, that no matter what I did or how hard I tried, I would still be a brief spark in a world of long flames. But he was wrong. Not about the years, about what they meant. A handful of years is enough. It has to be enough. Because that is what humans understand that most of the galaxy does not. We do not love because we have time. We love because we do not. Every human relationship, every friendship, every parent holding a newborn child, is built on the understanding that it will end. We know from the day we are born that we are running out of time, and we love each other anyway. We love harder because of it. We love recklessly and completely and without reservation, because the clock is always ticking, and we have decided, as a species, that the ticking does not matter. That is what the Velari saw in me. That is what the Torvali could not comprehend, and the Melusine could not process, and the Dranathi called dangerous. Not strength, not technology, not strategic value, just the stubborn, irrational, magnificent human refusal to let the brevity of life be an excuse for the absence of love. I looked at the stars. I thought about Silly, asleep in her room, her skin dimmed to a soft glow, her small hand curled around the stone she had carved my name into. I thought about Aelith, sitting in the next room, reading, waiting. I thought about the centuries stretching out ahead of me now, impossibly long, impossibly full, and I felt something that I had never felt before in my entire life. I felt like I was home. Not a house, not a planet, not a coordinate on a star map. Home, the real kind. The kind that is made of people and trust and showing up and staying. They keep calling it a reward. The diplomats and the journalists and the historians who will write about this day. They frame it as a transaction. A human who did a brave thing and received an unbelievable gift in return. They will turn it into a story about politics and prophecy and the power dynamics between species. They will miss the point entirely. I was not rewarded. I was rescued. I was a man drowning in a life I had built specifically to keep me from